Some creature out of time was hovering over us, more than 1,000,000 years old.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks to any of the subscribers that have subscribed to the channel. Really appreciate the support. And if you're new to the channel and you like this and you want to delve a little bit more to some of the other videos, then please do, and like and subscribe if you like it. So I've been taking part in this Horror Mayhem challenge that the Bookish Bryants created, and all through May there's kind of a concentration on horror. And I've read the Hellbound Heart, which I did a review for, and I read the Nothing But Blackened Teeth, which I did a review for, and I've decided to focus a lot on short stories as well. So I said before I wanted to do a regular feature called Spotlight on Short Stories, and I've combined that with Horror Mayhem for this video, do a video about some of the short stories I've been reading, and then once I've done this video, I'm going to be finishing Horror Mayhem with my first encounter with Stephen Graham Jones. So I'm looking forward to that, and that's going to be for the folklore challenge. But in the meantime, this is going to be all about short stories, and I'm going to talk about 10 short stories that I've read this month for Horror Mayhem, and they span from 1835, I think it is, 1835. Oh, got me. Yeah, 1835 to 1992. The most recent one was 1992, and the oldest one is 1835. So 10 stories, and it covers, some of them are very famous. Well, one of them in particular is very famous, but there's the first one I'm going to start with is quite famous, and relatively obscure maybe on a couple of them. No, actually, I mean, it hits a lot of famous authors. So just a quick rundown of the authors that are going to be covered in these 10 stories. Arthur Machen, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Rudyard Kipling, Joe Hensley, Ray Bradbury, Algernon Blackwood, John W. Campbell, Richard Christian Matheson, and I think that's it. Oh, and H.P. Lovecraft. I read a H.P. Lovecraft story as well. So all of that kind of gives me quite a nice little breadth of time and different styles of authors for these 10 stories. And I have had a mixed response. So I really liked some of them, didn't particularly like a few of them, and just thought some of them were just okay. So I'm going to start with the first one I read once I'd read Nothing But Blackened Teeth. I dived into this one, this was for the prompt about cosmic horror, and this is Who Goes There? So John W. Campbell is a really influential and important figure in science fiction and speculative fiction because of his editing career, editing lots of magazines for science fiction, horror and fantasy and all that kind of stuff. So really important figure, but he wrote Who Goes There? So Who Goes There is the story that is the basis for two films, The Thing from Another World from the 50s, and more importantly, because it's a work of genius, John Carpenter's 1982 film called The Thing. I've seen that film so many times. I love it so much. Definitely one of my joint favourite films of all time, certainly on the serious films anyway. So I did read Who Goes There a long time ago, and I read it again for this Horror Mayhem, and it's just as good. It does have some differences from the films. I mean, the Thing from Another World film is very different, but John Carpenter did go back into the source and did take some things that were in this story, and it's just the tension's built up really well. The setting, well, I'll tell you in case you don't know what the two films are about and you haven't seen John Carpenter's masterpiece, The Thing. Basically, in Antarctica, these research scientists find they find an alien, and they want to investigate what it is, and they want to do more research on what they found, and they want to thaw it out. And there's lots of debate amongst the scientific crew about whether they should thaw it out or not, and just all hell breaks loose when they start messing around with the thing, with the alien, and it's really horrific, and It's really tense. In a very short story, it's about 50 pages, I think, from what I remember. In a very short story, you do get a sense of the different characters. So they are characterized, which is quite nice, even with a short story like that, and with so much drama and action involved in the story. But you do get a sense of the difference between the characters, and some of them absolutely panic, and some of them are sort of more level-headed. It's interesting that Macready, in the story, looking at it again, he's described as this giant, and in the 1982 John Carpenter film, famously, he's played by Kurt Russell. Absolutely brilliant performance, but it ain't a giant, but a small difference, really, to be fair. But yeah, this story is fantastic, and it absolutely deserves the reputation it's got. It's nice to read it again, and sometimes it does appear in different collections. This is the version I've got, but you can get it on its own as well now, so you can search for Who Goes There, and you can buy it as a novella. But yeah, definitely recommend you read that one. So Who Goes There was the first out of the 10 stories I'm going to talk about. It's the first one I read out of this 10. It was a reread for me, and absolutely loved it. So big win for that one. And this was written in 1948. So John W. Campbell, 1948. Who Goes There? A story about suspicion, distrust, paranoia, absolute palpable tension. It didn't really bring it on themselves, but they are absolutely powerless to figure out what's going on. And the ending is different in this, by the way, than the film. I love the ending of the 82 film. But yeah, Who Goes There? Great story. Okay, so then I read a story that's in this collection. I got this collection from the library, hence the library page here. I got this from the library, and I got it because of Horror Mayhem, and I found this in there when I was looking through it, and I thought, oh, this would be nice to add to what I'm reading. So this is a collection of late Victorian Gothic tales, and in particular, I was really pleased to see The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen was in this book. So I've heard a lot about the story, and I think there's a few people reading The Great God Pan for Horror Mayhem, but I had heard of it before, hadn't read it before. It's a late Victorian story, so it's going to be, it's going to have a style to it, I think, that I was expecting, very dry and sort of authoritative tone, but with a sense of wonder. I think often you get that. So I went in there knowing it was from 1894, it was written, but not really knowing a lot else, and curious to see what the plot was going to be and what I think of the story. So, The Great God Pan, written in 1894, it's a story of a man called Clark who knows a kind of mad scientist kind of character called Dr. Raymond, and he has basically been asked by Dr. Raymond to witness and support him on this experiment he wants to do. And he basically wants to commit brain surgery to someone he knows called Mary, who he thinks is a great candidate for this experiment. And he wants to do this surgery on Mary's brain so that she can be released into a state where she is open to receive the spiritual world. So that's the idea of the experiment, and that's played out through the beginning of the story, and it basically effectively becomes a lobotomy, and she becomes what the book describes as an idiot through this surgery. So it then cuts to somewhere in the future, and there's a character called Helen who is causing a lot of disturbances in the village, and there's lots of rumours about her cavorting with a beast in the forest. She keeps going into the forest at night. There's all sorts of rumour and mystery around this character called Helen, and there's lots of mysterious suicides that are also connected to this character called Helen. And you eventually realise by the end of the story that Helen is Mary's daughter. So the character that had the surgery in the first place gave birth to Helen. And it's also implied in the story that Pan, who's the evil spirit that comes into contact with Mary at the beginning of the story, impregnated her, and produced Helen. So that's the kind of the point of the story. But because it's written in 1894, because of the way it's written, and because of the particular target that Arthur Machen decides to make for the victims of the surgery, and the way that Mary and Helen are kind of this sort of wild beast kind of character that's all kind of deranged and full of this evil spirit, you can kind of wonder if it's connected to late Victorian worries about gender and about the power struggle between the genders and about that worry about change, because obviously in the late 1800s the world was changing a lot and there was this anxiety in literature. So you do wonder if that's what's going on with the story. But as far as the way it's written, I found it quite disjointed and it's not very clearly written, I don't think. You do get what's going on, but it doesn't really it doesn't do you any favours, and I don't think it's written very clearly, and it's very dry, and I think at the time it would have been quite shocking and quite evocative, whereas I think it is quite dated now. So The Great God Pan, hugely influential and important book. It gets cited a lot by most of the classic horror writers, talk about what an important story it is for them. So there's no doubt about how important it is. But for me, I didn't enjoy it that much. And I'm glad I've read it. But I think out of the 10 stories I read this month for Horror Mayhem, I find The Great God Pan is one of the weaker ones for me. So there we go. Arthur Machen, Welsh writer, who wrote this extremely influential story, The Great God Pan, in 1894. And then I started delving into this book. So this is Rod Serling's Triple W, Witches, Warlocks and Werewolves. And I've had this a long time, and I really like this collection. But it's an interesting one because there's some stories in there that go way back. And the oldest story in this collection of 10 stories I'm talking about is from this book. So this is a book that's edited by Rod Serling, and he just brought some classic authors together for a delve into horror. So this was the book where I first read, the first one I read from this book. Again, this was a reread, but recently, I mean, I haven't read this book for decades, but I read Rudyard Kipling's story, Mark of the Beast, and I thought, this is probably a werewolf one. So it was, again, it was okay. There was a sense of the old kind of imperialist perspective in the story, which is fine because I'm quite happy to see, to read someone else's sort of more old-fashioned viewpoint if I know it's written from then. But there was that sort of undertone in some of it. But the overall, the story didn't really grab me that much, and it was just an interesting thing to read a horror story by Rudyard Kipling. So I moved on. That was in 1891 that was written. And then I read Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And that was the oldest one out of these 10 stories, and that's from 1835. And I really like this story. It's got a really interesting style to it. It's very vivid, very descriptive in a very emotive way, and it's basically trying to depict this kind of haunting, creepy forest that is the main setting for the story. So Goodman Brown tells his wife that he's got to go to Salem, and it's not really said why, and she pleads with him not to go. I think there's some sense that people are afraid of the forest. And on his way through the forest, he meets this man of about 50 with this serpent staff. And basically, once meeting that man, it all gets a little bit hectic with some other villagers that are going in that direction. And it's clear that there's this sort of dreamlike, sort of mysterious event that happens through the telling of the story in this forest with these villagers and with this old man with the serpent. And through this story, it absolutely confuses Goodman Brown, and it changes his relationship with his wife. It changes his relationship with his own sense of religion, his faith, and his sense of security, his own sense of feeling okay. And he ends the story, no spoilers, but he ends the story with this much more downbeat, gloomy, cynical, withdrawn attitude to life through this strange, mysterious encounter that is described really well in the story. So yeah, I thought it's a very short story, but I enjoyed it. I thought it was really well written and made me curious about Nathaniel Hawthorne. So 1835, that was the next one I read from this collection of stories and from this book. And then I read another story from this book, which was by Joe Hensley, and that is from the year 1953, and that was called And Not Quite Human. Again, hadn't heard of the author before, didn't know what to expect, and this has been such a long time since I read this book that it was really fresh, as if I hadn't read it before. And it was called Not Quite Human because it was basically a vampire, but it was a science fiction story with a vampire in it, so literally it's set in space, so that was a little bit different. Quite enjoyed it. It was very short and not a lot happens, but it was a nice little vignette, a very short story. So that was quite a nice little addition to this series. It wasn't like mind-blowing. Certainly so far in the list I've been talking about, Young Goodman Brown and Who Goes There, definitely my favourites. But then after that, I moved on to the master, Ray Bradbury. So The October Country, I remembered, this is another reread, but I remembered that this one had much more of a horror feel to it than some of his other ones that are kind of fancy science fiction based. So I picked some of the stories that are in this collection because I thought it'd be really nice to add this book to the Horror Mayhem books. So The October Country, definitely recommend this. I mean, I'd recommend anything that Ray Bradbury has written. But I had a vague recollection of Skeleton that was written in 1956, and I wanted to read that again. And it's a brilliant story. Again, it's quite short. It's about 12, 13 pages or something. And it is about a man who is extremely uncomfortable, is in a lot of pain, and he tells his wife that he doesn't think there's something not quite right about him. And she's being very reassuring, go see the doctor, all that kind of thing. And he basically becomes very self-aware of his skeleton, and he gets quite sickened by it. He is actually physically sick when thinking about his skeleton, and he wants to deal with the fact that he's got a skeleton, and his mind starts fixating on it. And don't want to spoil the ending, but it's got a fantastic ending. And a curious thing about a doctor chewing on bone and things like that. But it's a really good. He doesn't want his skeleton anymore, and he wants to get it removed. But I don't want to spoil it by telling you what happens. But yeah, really good story there from Ray Bradbury, Skeleton. And then I read a story called There Was an Old Woman. And again, it's Ray Bradbury. He doesn't usually fail to entertain you. This is about a woman who invites a well-dressed man into her house. She's very lively and kind of like overexcitable. She invites this man into her house, and later on through the story you realise that he's deaf. So you can see that this is a story about a woman who is encountering death, but she's not aware of it, and she kind of beats death through her enthusiasm and her lively nature, and kind of reconnects with her body, and it's quite unusual, but it totally works. Yeah, the character's called Aunt Tildy, and she's got a daughter called Emily that also features in the story, and Emily is horrified by what she's seeing, and Aunt Tildy is very excitedly reacting to these people in her house and this wicker basket that is connected to what's happened to her body and things like that. And yeah, it's just a really unusual story about an encounter with death, and it's definitely worth reading. So those were the two stories I read from the October Country, and I'll read the rest of them again. I want to go through all of Ray Bradbury's books again because it's been so long since I read them. So There Was No Woman is an awesome addition to Horror Mayhem. And then I started delving into this book, Tales of Dungeons and Dragons. This is a really interesting collection. This is edited by Peter Haining with an introduction by Ray Bradbury, and it features really interesting list of authors. So I'll just go over some of the people that are in there, and you can see why I thought this was a good one for Horror Mayhem. So you've got Bram Stoker, Edgar Allan Poe, William Faulkner, Robert Bloch, John Wyndham, Stephen King, M.R. James, Algernon Blackwood, T.H. White, Fritz Leiber, William Morris, Lord Dunsany, Heath Robinson, H.P. Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, and Ray Bradbury, and a few others. So an interesting selection of authors there. And I basically picked the H.P. Lovecraft story that was in here and the Algernon Blackwood story that's in here. So those were the two I picked from here for Horror Mayhem. And it's been a while since I've read a H.P. Lovecraft story. So I did ages ago have the At the Mountains of Madness collection. And I read that one when I was a teenager. But that's a long time ago. And I do remember how I felt about H.P. Lovecraft at the time. But I thought I'll give it another go and see what I thought. And I felt the same again. So clearly, H.P. Lovecraft is hugely influential, obviously. But I think part of that is because how well he describes the horror of what's happening with these creatures that he creates and this unspeakable beast that is before these innocent humans that encounter these things. And obviously you can see that can lead right up to the Clive Barker stuff and some of the more grisly horrors that get written. Definitely H.P. Lovecraft is a huge influence on that. But I find that with H.P. Lovecraft, and it could be that I need to read the right story again, but certainly with this story, which was Challenge from Beyond, which was from 1935, it was just fantastically described, but not a lot happened. So it was like there was this sort of superficial setting where really evocative descriptions were happening, but not really with much of a context. So I found that I was quite detached from it. So as far as a story goes, I thought it was a little bit disappointing, but the actual creation of the horror was definitely in the text, done really well. So it's very evocatively written, but there wasn't really much of a story going on. So that was, I remember thinking that was a little bit of an issue for Lovecraft for me when I was younger. And that was definitely an issue for me for the Challenge from Beyond story. So that was the Lovecraft story I read in this book. And then I read the Algernon Blackwood story, which was called Magic Mirror. So Magic Mirror kind of reminded me of like Roald Dahl or sometimes the Twilight Zone episode kind of writing and some of the Richard Matheson kind of stuff where the final moment of the story is kind of unexplained, but a great way to end what had been set up before. So Magic Mirror is a story about a man who is retelling this story about a mirror that was used by this person that he met to basically win at gambling, to win at the roulette table. And he keeps consistently winning every time he uses this magic mirror. And it's a very short story. Something happens after using it too much. So, again, don't want to spoil it in case you want to read it. But I quite enjoyed it. I thought it was a nice little story. It's from 1938. Algernon Blackwood, who is obviously a very important author. And I thought that was a good one. And the ending takes you by surprise. And it's a little bit odd, but I think it works. So, Magic Mirror, from this book, this collection. And then, just to finish off, I think I've talked about every story out of these 10 except for one. Yes, so this last one I read is the most recent one, and that was from 1992, and I was drawn to it because it's by Richard Christian Matheson. So Richard Christian Matheson is Richard Matheson's son, and again, this was another reread, another book that I read many, many years ago, but I thought I'd get it out and pick something for Horror Mayhem from this book, and it's a book called Shock Rock. So these are stories that are based around the music industry and rock musicians. It's got an introduction by Alice Cooper, which is quite cool, and some interesting authors in the collection. So authors like Stephen King, F. Paul Wilson, David Shaw, Nancy Collins, Ronald Kelly, Graham Masterton, Paul Dale Anderson, Mark Garrett, Bill Mumy, and Peter David. So Bill Mumy is an actor, I don't know if you know him, but he was in Lost in Space as a kid and The Twilight Zone as a kid, and he played one of the main characters in Babylon 5. So there's a story about him in here, and Richard Christian Matheson, and a bunch of other people. So it's all quite modern, and there's swearing and sex in it and those kind of things. But I was quite shocked by the Richard Christian Matheson story. It's called Groupies. So it's from 1992, like I said, and it's very short, but it's quite brutal and violent, and it's to do with a groupie that was murdered by another groupie and by the rock star that they were hanging around. And it's quite a nasty story, really. And it's all based around a film that this detective is watching, or a journalist is watching. And yeah, it's quite graphic and quite nasty. So that was a bit shocking. So genuinely shocked by the story in Shock Rock. And it's got to be said, Richard Matheson would not have written the story in that way. So I think there's definitely a more of a modern feel for the stuff that Richard Christian Matheson writes. I've noticed that before, to be fair, on something else I'd read by him. So Groupies is a very violent story about groupie being murdered. So 10 stories, Horror Mayhem, spotlight on short stories. Short stories are awesome because you can get so much packed into a story. You don't have to make it 300-400 pages. You can get a really good story told in just 12 pages in some of those examples, or 50 pages, which is kind of more, I'd say it's more normal for a short story. But it doesn't matter what the length is. You know, if you've got that kind of skill of getting that short, to the point, thematic thing out there with a short word count, then you know that can be really powerful and really evocative. So yeah, a spread of different decades there, going right back to 1835. Horror Mayhem. The next thing I'm going to read is this. So on the announcement video I made, I did say I was going to read this for the folklore challenge. So this has had loads of great reviews, so I'm looking forward to reading this. And I found this one by the same author really cheap at a charity shop, so I bought that as well. So I will end up having an opinion on Stephen Graham Jones very soon, so I'm looking forward to that. But particularly look forward to The Only Good Indians, because I remember when it came out, people were talking about how brilliant it was. So that's my last thing in the Horror Mayhem month, because we're right at the end of the month now. And I need to catch up on a few other things I needed to read that weren't horror, that sort of sci-fi, fantasy things. But also, it's my birthday in an hour's time. So I'm going to be book shopping tomorrow. And with a few other things I've got, there's probably going to be a book haul coming, because I'm hoping to find some things tomorrow. So I'll let you know if anything cool turns up in that book haul video I'm going to do. So I'm looking forward to that. But in the meantime, again, huge thanks to Bookish Bryants for bringing up this Horror Mayhem idea. I think it's been really good. And it was nice to concentrate on these horror stories for the spotlight on short stories for this month as well, sort of combining the two things together. And finishing off with The Only Good Indians is going to be a good way to finish off the month. So, yeah, Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks a lot for watching. Bye.
Paint me a picture of what it's like to be